The night was cold, even for Colorado. The truck's engine rumbled as Roy Bennett's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the empty road ahead. He'd been on this stretch countless times before, a lonely highway cutting through the thick forest. The dark silhouettes of pine trees loomed on either side, silent sentinels watching over the road. Roy wasn't one to talk about his past. He didn't want to. The road was his only companion, his only true friend. He'd spent the last 17 years driving, staying one step ahead of whatever haunted him, keeping his emotions locked away. A man who was always moving, never stopping long enough to form connections. Relationships, feelings, they were a thing of the past. But tonight something felt different. He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the strange quiet that settled over the mountains. Or perhaps it was the feeling in his gut that something was about to happen. As he rounded a sharp bend, the headlights suddenly illuminated a figure ahead of him on the road. At first it was just a shadow, a dark blur. But as he drew closer, his heart skipped a beat. It was a dog. Roy slammed on the brakes. A German shepherd, barely able to walk, its thin body swaying as it staggered along the edge of the road. The fur on its back was matted with dirt and burrs. Its sides heaved, the ribs sticking out sharply, each breath labored. She was clearly pregnant. But what made Roy pause wasn't just the dog's condition. It was the way she moved. Her pace wasn't slow because she was tired. It was purposeful, as if she was walking toward something, or someone. She didn't even look up as his headlights bathed her in light, didn't lift her head to ask for help. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, unwavering, determined. Her posture didn't scream weakness. It screamed urgency. For a moment, Roy thought about driving past. It was the kind of decision he'd made 100 times before. Ignore the distractions, keep moving. But something in the dog's eyes stopped him. He couldn't explain it. With a heavy sigh, Roy pulled the truck over to the side of the road, cut the engine, and opened the door. He walked to the dog, kneeling down to her level. Her fur was matted, tangled with twigs and debris, her eyes sunken and weary, but there was something else there. Something sharp, intelligent. She didn't growl, didn't cower. She just looked at him. He spoke softly, a whisper almost. "Hey girl, you all right?" She didn't respond, but Roy wasn't expecting her to. He had spent enough time on the road to know that animals had a way of communicating their needs, even without words. Roy knelt beside her, gently placing his hand on her head. She didn't flinch. He could feel the heat coming off her body. She was burning with fever. There was a hesitation in Roy's movements, a brief moment where he thought maybe he should leave her. After all, he was a trucker. He didn't have time for things like this. But then he remembered the way she had looked at him. She needed help. "Come on, girl," Roy muttered under his breath. He reached under her belly and carefully lifted her, guiding her into the cab of the truck. The dog didn't resist. She seemed to know what was happening. She climbed in without a sound, curled up in the passenger seat, and rested her head on the armrest. Her breathing slowed, though it was still shallow. Roy drove on, his thoughts racing. What was a dog doing out here, alone? And why was she so far from any town? He didn't know the answers, but something told him he wouldn't be able to just keep driving. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and Roy hoped the vet could help. But as he drove, he glanced at the dog. She was so exhausted, so drained. It broke something inside him to see her like that. He didn't know why, but he felt a pull. Maybe it was because he recognized that feeling of exhaustion. He had been running for so long, too. He sighed and pressed the accelerator a little harder, pushing through the night, knowing that something had changed in him. That something in that dog's eyes had changed everything. The road to the small town felt longer than it ever had before. The truck's tires rumbled against the asphalt, the hum of the engine blending with the steady rhythm of Roy's thoughts. His mind kept drifting back to the dog, her hollow eyes, her exhausted body, her silent strength. There was something about her that unsettled him, something that made him want to help even though he usually avoided anything that asked for his attention. As Roy turned into the town, the first signs of daylight began to break across the horizon. the pale orange light creeping over the mountains. He slowed the truck and pulled up outside a small, modest clinic. The sign on the front read, Dr. Laura Simmons, veterinarian. It looked like the kind of place that had seen everything but probably wasn't prepared for much more. But Roy didn't care. He just needed help for the dog. Roy hopped out of the truck and gently helped the dog down. She was barely able to stand, her legs shaky, but she followed him into the clinic without complaint. Dr. Simmons, a woman in her mid-40s, greeted them with a warm but tired smile as they entered. Her eyes flicked briefly to the dog, her face tightening in concern. "She looks in rough shape," she said, stepping forward. "What happened to her?" "I found her on the road, not far from here," Roy replied, his voice low. "She was walking alone, barely able to move. I think she's pregnant." Dr. Simmons nodded and motioned for Roy to place the dog on the examination table. He did so gently, avoiding jarring her frail body. The vet examined the dog closely, moving her limbs, checking her temperature, feeling her abdomen with practiced hands. "She's definitely pregnant," Dr. Simmons said, pausing. "But she's exhausted, almost to the point of collapse. She looks like she's been running for miles." Roy swallowed hard. "Is she going to be okay?" "We'll see," the vet replied, her face softening. "She's going to need a lot of care, but it's possible. I'll need to run some tests to make sure she doesn't have any underlying injuries. She might have been on the move for days." Roy's eyes scanned the dog's body as the vet worked. There were scratches and scrapes across her paws, dried blood in places. She had clearly been through something painful. But what had driven her to keep going? To walk through the night so far from civilization? Dr. Simmons paused, gently lifting the dog's collar to check her ID tag. But what she found underneath stopped her in her tracks. A small, folded handkerchief. Roy's eyes widened as she unfolded it, revealing a name embroidered in the fabric. "Michael." Roy blinked in confusion. "What's that?" The vet frowned, her fingers tracing the delicate embroidery. It's a name, Michael. But this doesn't make any sense." Roy's gut twisted. Michael. A name on a handkerchief. The kind of detail that meant something, but what? Who was Michael? Could it be from her owner? Roy asked, though he didn't believe it for a second. The dog was too wild, too desperate. Dr. Simmons shook her head. "This is strange. This doesn't seem like something an owner would just leave with their dog." She paused, looking at Roy. "We need to get her checked for injuries. I'll call in a specialist to examine her more closely. But in the meantime, it wouldn't hurt to check the local news. Maybe we can figure out who Michael is." Roy wasn't sure what he was hoping for, but he agreed. As Dr. Simmons continued her work, Roy stepped outside to his truck. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and started browsing through the local news, his fingers scrolling through the headlines. His eyes stopped when he saw a story about a missing child. The headline screamed at him, "Search for missing boy ends amid storm. Authorities unable to locate 4-year-old." The article detailed the disappearance of Michael Davis, a 4-year-old boy who had gone missing 2 days earlier in the nearby mountains. The search had been called off due to the storm, and the article noted that there had been no new leads. Roy's heart skipped a beat. The name from the handkerchief. Michael. The same boy. The dog had been looking for him. She had been searching for help. Roy turned and looked back at the clinic, his heart pounding. He had to find out what was going on. He couldn't just walk away now. He had never been the type to get involved, to take risks. But something in the dog's eyes had changed him. And now, staring at the article, Roy knew he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't just leave. Roy barely registered the passing hours as he sat in the clinic's waiting room. Dr. Simmons had insisted on keeping the dog overnight for observation, making sure she was stable enough to travel. But Roy couldn't shake the feeling that something was pushing him to act. He couldn't stop thinking about Michael. The boy. The handkerchief. The dog that had somehow known to search, to look for help. Roy needed answers, and he wasn't about to wait for someone else to find them. After a few more minutes, Dr. Simmons walked into the waiting room, her expression serious but softer than before. She gave Roy a tight smile. "I've set up a few treatments for her. but she's going to need a lot of rest. I suggest you keep her in the truck tonight, she said. It'll be easier for her to relax in a familiar space. Roy nodded, his thoughts already on the road ahead. He didn't care about the dog's comfort for the moment. He had to find Michael. You said we should check the news, he said to the vet. I saw something about a missing boy. Michael Davis. Dr. Simmons frowned. I saw that too. 4-year-old boy. They've been looking for him in the mountains. His parents, they've been frantic. I don't know if the police have any new leads, but with the storm, they've been focused on the search and rescue efforts, trying to make sure no one else gets lost in the weather. Roy's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. The mountains. The place where the boy had been last seen. I'm heading to those mountains, Roy said, his voice steady but determined. I think I know where to look. The vet's brow furrowed. Are you sure? The conditions up there are brutal. No one's been able to find him. The storm. It's not safe to go searching alone. Roy felt a sharp pang of guilt. He had no experience in search and rescue. He was just a trucker. But something in him had already made up his mind. He couldn't ignore it now. Not after everything he'd seen. Someone has to do it, Roy said quietly. I won't wait around for the storm to clear. I'll find him. The dog knows the way. She's been looking for him. Dr. Simmons didn't argue. She could see the resolve in Roy's eyes, and she knew better than to try and change his mind. I'll make sure Roxy stays stable tonight. You'll need to stay with her, but you can't leave without help. If anything happens, I'll be careful. Roy cut her off. But I'm going. With that, Roy made up his mind. He drove out of the clinic's lot, the low rumble of the engine filling the silence. His thoughts churned. What if he was wrong? What if Roxy was just a dog, lost and confused? What if there was no boy to find? But as he glanced at her lying in the seat next to him, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and shallow, he knew he couldn't back down now. Roxy had found him. She had brought him here. And now it was his turn to return the favor. The drive was long, the miles slipping by unnoticed as Roy wound his way deeper into the mountainous region. The sun had set by the time he arrived, and the sky was an inky black with only the stars and moon for light. The storm clouds still hung low over the peaks, the winds beginning to pick up once again, biting through the windshield and making the trees sway ominously. The roads up the mountain were treacherous, narrow, and unpaved. Roy's truck bumped and jostled over the uneven ground, but he didn't mind. The farther he went, the more certain he became that he was doing the right thing. He couldn't explain it, but something told him the boy was out there. And Roxy, she knew. As they neared the location where Michael had been last seen, the wind howled around them. Roy could feel the temperature drop, the air growing colder as the elevation increased. His breath fogged up the truck's window, and Roxy stirred beside him, her ears twitching. The truck rattled over the rough terrain, and for a moment, Roy thought about turning back. He was just a man with a dog and an old truck. What did he think he could accomplish here? But Roxy's eyes met his for a brief moment. Her gaze was intense, unblinking, and it reassured him more than anything else could. She had brought him here for a reason. They had to keep going. Roy parked the truck near a clearing, just outside the dense trees where the last search party had begun. The moonlight cut through the gaps in the trees, revealing a path leading deeper into the forest. Roxy sniffed the air, her body tense, her tail held low. She stepped toward the woods, her legs trembling, but with a purpose. Roy followed closely behind, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his shoulders. They walked in silence, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the distant rustle of the wind. Roy's flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness, but Roxy's nose was keen. She was leading him somewhere. They followed the trail for what seemed like hours, winding their way up and through the trees, the underbrush thick and twisted. Roy's heart pounded in his chest as the cold seeped into his bones. But Roxy pressed on, guiding him with unyielding determination. And then, through the trees, something caught his eye. A flash of color. Red. Roy's breath hitched as they neared a small clearing, and in the center, nestled between two large trees, was a tiny makeshift shelter, just big enough for a small child to hide. There, curled up beneath a thick blanket of leaves, was Michael. Roy's breath caught in his throat as he approached the small shelter. His flashlight illuminated the form huddled beneath the leaves. A child, so small and frail, barely visible under the makeshift cover. The wind howled around them, but inside the shelter, there was a strange, eerie stillness. The only movement came from the boy's shallow, uneven breaths. Roxy padded softly beside Roy, her eyes never leaving the boy. She seemed to know exactly where she was, where she needed to be. Roy hesitated for a moment, the weight of the moment pressing on him. What if it wasn't Michael? What if he was too late? The boy looked so small, so helpless, barely moving in the cold. But Roxy's quiet growl snapped him out of his hesitation. She sniffed the ground and took a step closer, urging him forward. He crouched down beside the shelter and gently reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the blanket. "Hey, kid," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "It's okay. I'm here to help." At the sound of his voice, the boy stirred slightly, his tiny hand gripping the edge of the blanket. Roy could see the remnants of tears on his cheeks, frozen in the cold. His clothes were torn, his skin pale and battered from the harsh weather. "Michael," Roy said again, his voice softer now, as if saying the name would somehow make it real. The boy's eyes fluttered open. They were wide, filled with confusion, fear, but also a faint glimmer of recognition. For a moment, they just stared at each other, as if neither of them could quite believe this was happening. "Michael, it's okay. You're safe now," Roy murmured, his heart racing. The boy's lips parted slightly, and he whispered, his voice weak, "Roxy, you found me." Roy's heart clenched at the sound of the dog's name. It was as if Michael knew exactly what had brought him here, knew why Roxy had led him to this moment. Roy carefully reached down and scooped the child into his arms. The boy was light, too light. His body shivered against Roy's chest, his arms clutching weakly at Roy's jacket as if he might fall at any moment. "You're going to be okay now," Roy whispered, holding the boy close. "Roxy got you here. We're going to get you out of here." But just as he started to pull away, Roxy growled once more, the sound low and urgent. Roy turned, but it was already too late. The dog's body was trembling, her legs weak beneath her. She staggered and collapsed to the ground with a soft whimper, her breath coming in shallow pants. Roy's eyes widened in horror. "Roxy!" He knelt beside her, cradling her head in his lap, his hands trembling as he checked for injuries. Her breathing was rapid, shallow. And then, just like that, there was a sharp, painful gasp, and Roxy let out a low whine. Her body twitched. Roy's heart skipped a beat. "Roxy!" "No," he whispered, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. Not now. But it was happening. The dog was going into labor. Right here. Right now. The cold wind howled around them, and Roy could feel the storm closing in, its icy fingers gripping tighter with each passing second. But he couldn't just leave. Not now. Not after everything. As Michael lay still in his arms, Roy's thoughts raced. He had to take care of both of them. The boy needed help, but so did the dog. "Hang on, Roxy," Roy muttered through gritted teeth. "You're gonna be okay." He turned his focus to the dog, his mind spinning. There was no time to waste. He had to keep Roxy calm, keep her alive long enough to get her to safety. And he couldn't afford to leave Michael alone. Carefully, Roy settled the boy on the ground beside Roxy. The child was too weak to sit up on his own, but at least he wasn't in immediate danger. Roxy whimpered, her eyes filled with pain, but she continued to nudge Roy's hand, as if urging him to stay close. She was fighting, but Roy could see the exhaustion in her eyes. This wasn't going to be easy. His hands were shaking as he gently cradled her belly, feeling the contractions. It wasn't right, he knew it. She needed medical attention, but they were miles away from the nearest hospital, and the storm was already worsening. But there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, Roy tried to calm himself. Roxy needed him. Michael needed him. He was all they had, and for the first time in years, he realized that he wasn't alone. He couldn't just drive away from this. "Stay with me, girl," Roy whispered, stroking Roxy's head. "We're getting through this. Together." The storm had hit with a vengeance. The wind howled like a wild animal, and the rain came down in sheets, the cold biting at Roy's skin as he sat on the forest floor, holding Roxy's head in his lap. His heart was racing as he kept one eye on the dog, her body trembling with each contraction, and the other on Michael, who was still curled up weakly beside them. The boy had barely spoken since Roy found him. His small hands clutched the corner of the handkerchief that had been hidden under Roxy's collar, the last link between the dog and the child. But now, Michael's breathing was steady, and his wide eyes, filled with both fear and trust, seemed to follow Roy's every movement. "I'm not leaving you," Roy muttered, trying to keep his voice calm despite the chaos around them. The storm was growing fiercer, the wind pushing against the trees, shaking them violently, but Roy didn't care. He had made a promise to the boy, to the dog, and to himself. He wouldn't walk away. Not this time. Roxy whimpered again, her body shaking as the labor continued. Roy's hands were numb, the cold of the night and the urgency of the moment taking a toll on him. He could feel the heat radiating from Roxy's body, and yet, she was still too weak to move, her breath quick and shallow. Her eyes locked onto his once more, a silent plea in her gaze, and it was enough to push Roy into action. There was no time to wait, no time to waste. He needed to get them to safety, to get them help. But the storm was in full force, and the mountains around them were harsh, unforgiving. Roy took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to do this. He carefully adjusted Michael in his arms, making sure the boy was secure as he stood up. The child was weak but still clung to him, his small fingers gripping Roy's coat as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. "I'm gonna get you both to safety," Roy promised, even though he wasn't entirely sure how. He glanced back down at Roxy, who was still lying on the ground, breathing heavily. He couldn't just leave her. Roy stood tall and made a decision. There was an old ranger station about 5 miles from here, a place where he knew there might be shelter from the storm. It wasn't much, but it was something. With every ounce of strength he had left, Roy began to walk. Michael clutched tightly in one arm, his other hand gently cradling Roxy's head as he carefully coaxed her to her feet. She was too weak to walk on her own, but she stood for him, stumbling forward as he moved slowly through the trees, the wind and rain stinging his face. The weight of the journey was crushing, but Roy's resolve never faltered. There was no turning back. He couldn't lose either of them. The wind howled louder as they made their way through the dense forest, the trees shaking violently with every gust. Roxy was struggling, her body sagging under the effort, but she kept going. For Michael. For Roy. Roy's heart pounded as he looked down at the boy. Michael's face was pale, but his small hand gripped Roy's arm with a faint strength, as if trying to hold on to whatever warmth he could find in the storm. It took nearly an hour to reach the ranger station, the wind and rain making the journey unbearable. But when they finally arrived, Roy pushed open the creaking wooden door and stumbled inside, dragging Roxy in after him. The building was empty except for old supplies and a few dusty shelves, but it was dry, and that was all that mattered. Roy lowered Michael to the floor, his legs buckling beneath him from the exhaustion of the trek, and then quickly turned to Roxy. The dog was breathing heavily, her body trembling, her sides heaving as she lay on the floor. "Hang on, girl," Roy whispered, kneeling beside her. He knew there was no time to waste, and no one else would come to help. He had to be the one. Roy carefully set to work, his hands shaking as he tried to steady himself. There was no room for doubt now. He had come this far. He had to see this through. As Roxy lay on the floor, her eyes closed in exhaustion, Roy made sure she was as comfortable as he could manage. He kept talking to her, soothing her, his voice low and steady as the storm raged on outside. Minutes stretched into hours as Roxy's labor intensified. It was a delicate balance between the urgency of the situation and the calm he tried to provide. But slowly, despite the odds, it happened. Roxy gave one final push, and then, with a soft whimper, the first puppy was born. Roy held his breath as the tiny creature let out a faint whine. A puppy. Roxy's first. He didn't know how long it had been since he had felt anything like this. But in that moment, a strange calm washed over him. It was as if the storm outside had quieted, and the only thing that mattered now was here, in this tiny shelter. Roxy lay on the ground, still panting, her eyes open now as she gazed up at Roy. There was a bond there, a connection, something he had never thought possible with a dog. She had brought him here, and now they were together. As the last of the puppies were born, Roy could hardly believe what was happening. The storm was still raging, but in that moment, inside the small ranger station, it didn't matter. Roy wasn't alone anymore.